There are places in the Jedi Order's history where the line between the light and the dark begins to blur. Moments when the fear of the Sith grew so powerful that it consumed the Jedi themselves and made them do one of the worst things I have ever seen in Star Wars lore. In the centuries after the Great Sith War, the galaxy was scarred, and the Jedi Order was severely shaken. Many of their greatest seers had failed to predict the Sith's rise, and countless Jedi and innocents had died as a result. In that fear, a new faction took shape, one that believed it alone could protect the galaxy from the shadow of the Sith's return. It was called the Covenant, a secret circle of Jedi devoted not to training, not to healing, but to watching the horizon for signs of the dark side. They believed prophecy was a weapon, that future could be guarded if only one was ruthless enough to act before it was far too late. At its head was Krynda Dre, a woman haunted by her loss. Her husband had fallen in battle against the Sith, and her grief had hardened into paranoia. Krynda trusted visions more than the living, shadows more than her own, and around her gathered a group of seers, each Jedi convinced that they alone carried the burden of preventing the Sith's return. But fear is a dangerous guide. Fear twists duty into obsession, protection into control, and as the Covenant grew, so too did its willingness to sacrifice what it claimed to protect. This is a story not of a Sith betraying Jedi, but of Jedi turning against their own. A story of paranoia, prophecy, and fear, in one of the darkest chapters in the Jedi Order's entire long history. Today, my friends and lore junkies, we will be visiting the Padawan massacre. But first, we have experienced a terrible vision ourselves. Many who are watching our archives are not yet subscribed to the Order, and unlike the weak seers of the Jedi Covenant, we are certain of our future. Crush that subscribe button and join our Order. It is your destiny. But now, the holocron opens. The Great Sith War has ended, but its wounds have cut deep. On worlds across the Republic, cities lay in ruins, families were torn apart, and Jedi numbers had been thinned by betrayal and slaughter. For many, it was a time of mourning, and for none more than a woman by the name of Krynda Dre. Krynda had been a Jedi herself once, quiet, reserved, more gifted in the subtle disciplines of foresight rather than in battle. Her husband, though, Whitesand Dre, was the opposite. He was a warrior, a Jedi Knight who strode boldly into chaos of the Sith War, a war that he did not return from. Whitesand fell in service to the Order, leaving Krynda a widow and her infant son Lucien without a father. But Krynda's grief was not just personal. To her, Whitesand's death symbolized the failure of the Jedi Council, the greatest seers of all of this age. Men and women sworn to watch the currents of the Force had not seen the rise of Exar Kun. The Council had not seen Ulic Qel-Droma's fall either. The Sith had returned, and the Jedi were blind. Krynda's heart had been hardened by all of this. She no longer believed the Council could be trusted with the future. So, she turned inward, severing her ties from this version of the Order, but not abandoning her gifts in the Force. In the silence of her grief, she began to imagine something different. A circle of Jedi who would never again allow the Sith to rise, who would succeed where the Council had failed. A secret watch, unburdened by politics or hesitation. A covenant. Krynda devoted herself to this sole mission. She began gathering the most gifted seers that she could find, raising orphans of war, training them not for the battlefield, but rather for prophecy. Her first and her most devoted student was a Miraluka girl, a girl named Canilia, who saw not with her eyes, but rather using the Force itself. Then came Zamar. Zamar was from the species known as the Keel, whose visions burned with detail and intensity. Then you have Rana Te, a Togruta whose instincts were fierce and unshakable. And then you had Fioran Feln, whose own perspective gave him foresight on an almost primal level. Together they formed the First Watch Circle, bound by oath and bound by secrecy. Their task was simple but absolute, to peer into the currents of the Force to discern the signs of the Sith's return, and to act before the galaxy would suffer again. But even from the beginning there was something brittle in this vow. Where the Council sought patience, Krynda Dre demanded urgency. Where the Order sought balance, Krynda demanded certainty. Her watch circle did not question whether they should act, only when. Their loyalty was not to the Council, it wasn't even to the Republic, but to Krynda's vision. A vision birthed by fear. And then there was Lucien Dre, Krynda's only son. In another life, he may have been her legacy, the bridge between grief and hope. But Krynda was haunted by visions and chained to the Covenant. She could barely look at him. He simply looked too much like Whitesand. Instead, she entrusted his training not to herself, but to a bitter, half-crippled man by the name of Hazen. Hazen was a failed Jedi acolyte who had once dreamed of being chosen, but never was. Hazen would nurture Lucien's pride and resentment, feeding him a twisted sense of duty. To Krynda, Lucien was not a child to be loved, but was rather a role to be filled. When her circle of seers began to take shape, she gave him a title. She called him the Executor. He would not sit with the other seers, nor share their visions. His task was simpler, colder. He would enforce their will. He would be the sword of the prophecy. Thus the Covenant was born, a secret order within the Jedi Order itself, a cult of visionaries and enforcers who believed that they alone carried the burden of safeguarding the galaxy. They looked not to the light of the present, but to the shadow of the past and to the future. They saw only there the Sith. Years passed, the Covenant circle solidified, and their gaze turned ever outward, searching for signs of the Sith's resurgence. Their obsession was consuming them. Every ripple in the Force, every shadow in the vision, was dissected and feared. In 3969 BBY, the Covenant's watch circle was stationed at the Jedi Tower on Terrace. There was a satellite academy, one intended to teach Padawans far away from the bustles of Coruscant. It was here that 5 Jedi Padawans were placed under the care of the Covenant. Zane Carrick, a clumsy, well-meaning human whose training was marked by failure after failure. Shad Jelavan, a Padawan with a fire in his heart. Camlin, a Feline who was cunning and sharp. Garn, a Nagi who had a brooding discipline. Ujo, a Houdin who was gentle and thoughtful. Each one was paired with a Jedi Master. Most important, Krynda Dre, reluctantly, was paired with Zane Carrick. They had trained for years, and finally the time came for their final trial. The Covenant sent them to the Rogue Moon, a jagged planetoid in the Terra System asteroid belt. The moon was battered constantly by thousands of meteors every hour, turning its surface into a storm of fire and stone. The trial was a simple one. The Padawans would cross the moon in red environment suits, blind to everything but the Force, and to reach their masters waiting for them on the other side. This was a test of trust, intuition, and most importantly, survival. But for their masters, the trial was never about their students. While the Padawans braved the firestorm, the Covenant withdrew to meditate. They sought clarity. They wanted to glimpse further than they had ever done before, believing the chaos of the Rogue Moon would thin the veil between present and future. But what they saw shook them. One by one the visions came, visions of slaughter. Each of the masters saw themselves dying violently, struck down by a figure dressed in red, but importantly not the crimson robes of a Sith Lord, but the simple red environment suits that their Padawans now wore. The details differed. One saw their own body lying amid ruins, another saw flames consuming the Jedi Order, another saw the Republic collapsing into chaos. But there was one thread uniting it all: death at the hands of one of the Padawans. Fear spread through the circle like wildfire. The Covenant did not question whether the visions were real or true. They did not seek interpretation, they didn't seek balance, they didn't seek the Council's guidance. To the Covenant, the future was a blade already descending upon them. The Sith would return, and they would return through one of the very children now walking blindly towards them. The debate was immediate and fierce. Ronate and Feln argued that the danger was clear, that the Padawans must be killed. Kanalia hesitated, whispering that prophecy was not always literal. Zamar, the most measured of them, refused outright, not unless the Council was consulted first. They had sworn secrecy, yes, but could they truly justify killing their own students without proof of these visions? In the end, restraint came not from wisdom, but from Krynda Dre herself. When contacted through Hazen, she forbade the execution. Krynda demanded the Padawans be brought to her alive and immediately. She wanted to study them, to search their futures more carefully. But Lucien, the executor, enforcer, son, he had grown tired of his mother's commands. To him, the visions were undeniable. To hesitate was to risk her life, the Covenant's lives, perhaps even the entire Jedi Order. And so, in a single lie, he set the course for blood. Lucien told his fellow masters that the order had been given, that they had permission to act, that the decision was made. From that moment, the fate of 5 Padawans was sealed. They were no longer students. They were no longer children under the Covenant's care. They were potential Sith, future killers, prophecies in flesh, and the Covenant convinced themselves that the only way to save the galaxy would be to strike first. The Jedi were supposed to be guardians, but on that day, the Covenant became executioners. The days following the Rogue Moon trial were silent and strange. The Padawans, exhausted but hopeful, whispered among themselves in the Jedi Tower on Terrace. The Padawans believed their masters were debating whether or not they should finally be promoted to knighthood. Years of training had led to this moment. Excitement and nerves hung in the air. But behind closed doors, the Covenant was not debating merits or futures. They were crafting a story, a lie that would mask the truth of what they were about to do. Lucien Dre had told them that the order was clear. The Padawans were destined to bring about the Sith's return, and that they must die before the prophecy could unfold. The Covenant had agreed to act, and they would do so under the guise of celebration. A banquet was arranged. The Grand Hall of the Jedi Tower was lit with banners, tables piled with food, candles, flickering in the night as gold and white. To the Padawans, it was a night that they had dreamed of. To the Masters, it was an execution chamber. Inside the banquet chamber, the Padawans waited for Zane, who was late as usual. As they waited, Shad, Jellivan, who was eager and restless, glanced around the room. His eyes eventually fell, though, on something strange. Lucien Dre's lightsaber hanging at his side. The saber, Shad realized, was Zane's. Why would Lucien carry his student's weapon? The implication struck him like a blow. Could it be that Zane, the clumsy fool who failed every trial, had been chosen to be knighted before all of them? The other Padawans followed Shad's gaze. They saw their master's hands tighten. They saw their unease reflected in their own faces now. And for the first time, the Padawans doubted. The masters knew that the moment had come. Their secret was slipping. The students, the children, were beginning to see cracks in the story. And in a flash of decision, the masters ignited their lightsabers. What followed was no duel, no training exercise, no honorable contest of Jedi skill. What followed was slaughter. The Covenant struck with precision and merciless speed. Shad, who had only just now found his voice to question, was cut down before he could cry out. Camlin fell moments later, disbelief still lingering in her eyes. Garn, disciplined and fierce, managed to actually activate his lightsaber, only to be overwhelmed by his master Zamar. Ujo, the gentle Padawan, barely had time to raise his hands in peace before Feln's blade cut him down. They died without answers. They died without understanding. They died betrayed by the very people who had raised them. And then the doors opened. Zane, still winded from the chase, entered the hall with a grin, ready to apologize for his lateness. But then he saw his friends sprawled lifeless on the floor, the master standing over them, the killers. He looked to Lucien, the man who had guided him, who had scolded him, who had shaped him. He then looked at Cornelia, who had smiled gently at him, to Ranate, who had barked harsh orders in training, to Feln and Zamar, who had sat across from him at council. They were not Sith, they were Jedi. They were Jedi Masters, and they had just murdered all of his friends. Lucien stepped forward, his voice cold and commanding, telling Zane to surrender. But Zane's body moved before any thought could form. He turned and he ran. Behind him, the Masters shouted, their voices echoing off the walls of the tower. Ahead of Zane, the city sprawled out, unaware of the massacre that had just taken place in these sacred halls. The Covenant's plan shifted instantly. They would not admit to killing their students. Instead, they would spread a story. Shad, rejected for his headstrong nature, had finally snapped. In the Padawan's rage, he murdered his classmates before the Masters were forced to cut him down. Zane, the failure, the fool, was framed as Shad's accomplice, the Padawan butcher, the rogue Jedi. And so the Jedi's Covenant betrayal was buried beneath lies and propaganda. To the galaxy, the Terrace Four were victims of one Padawan's madness. To the Order, the Covenant remained watchful protectors. But to Zane, and to history, the truth is unmistakable. The Jedi killed their own. It wasn't an accident of war. It wasn't a corruption by Sith alchemy. No duel gone too far. This was a massacre. A cold, deliberate slaughter of children who trusted the lives of their Jedi Masters. Jedi Masters who were supposed to serve and protect. They betrayed that duty in the worst way possible. What makes the Padawan massacre chilling is not that the blood was spilled, but the reason why it was spilled. The Covenant were not Sith Lords consumed by hunger or power. They were Jedi who genuinely believed that they were saving the galaxy. They acted not out of cruelty, they acted out of fear. Fear of the Sith, fear of their visions, and fear of another failure. The Jedi were supposed to teach their Padawans how to master fear, to rise above it. Instead, these masters became slaves to it. They saw a shadow of the future, and they gave it more weight than the living, breathing children who had trusted them. Those Padawans loved their masters. They trained for years under them. They looked to them for guidance, laughed, and cried in their presence. In the Jedi way of life, the Master-Padawan bond was as close as family. To turn on that bond, to raise a blade against one's own student, is one of the darkest betrayals imaginable. This casts a very long shadow on the Jedi philosophy itself. Consider Krynda Dre, whose grief at the loss of her husband drove her to form the Covenant itself. Her attachment to him, her refusal to let go of that pain, became obsession. She was determined that no one else would suffer as she had, and yet in her zeal to prevent that suffering, she planted the seeds of an even darker tragedy. The Padawan massacre is one of the big reasons in the lore that the Jedi had such a problem with attachment. The Covenant and the massacre was born out of Krynda Dre's attachment to her husband and to her son, as well as the rest of the Covenant not being able to come to terms with the Great Sith War. The Jedi Covenant believed that they were acting alone that night on Terminus. They thought their visions had compelled them, that their paranoia had sealed their fate. But behind their blades stood another figure, one who never swung a lightsaber that night, yet may have been more responsible than all of them combined. His name was Hazen, a failed Padawan, crippled and scarred in the war, a man who never earned a lightsaber, never earned a seat on any council, but who wormed his way into the heart of one of the most powerful Jedi families in the Republic. It was Hazen who becomes Krynda Dre's confidant, whispering in her ear after the death of her husband. It was Hazen who raised her son Lucien in her neglect, shaping him into the Covenant's cold executor. And it was Hazen who took the Covenant's visions of doom and turned them into the justification of murder. The Jedi Covenant thought they were saving the galaxy by killing children who trusted them. In truth, they were acting on the philosophy of a man who believed that the Jedi and Sith were both incomplete. Hazen saw himself as the missing piece, the one who could merge Jedi foresight with Sith ruthlessness, turning prophecy into a weapon and a fear into a creed. Hazen was never a Sith Lord, he never wore the Darth title, but in many ways, Hazen was more dangerous, because unlike the Sith who sought to destroy the Jedi from without, Hazen destroyed them from within, manipulating their fear, guiding their hands, and leaving their order with blood on its conscience that it never truly atoned for. And if you guys are interested, and we get this video to say around 3,000 likes, then I will definitely make an entire holocron dedicated to Hazen. But anyway, my friends, and fellow lore junkies, what are your thoughts on the Padawan massacre of Terminus? Is this the worst thing that the Jedi have ever done? And is there any part of you that thinks that they were justified? As always, my friends, thank you so much for visiting the archives today, and may the Force be with you.